Where's the first appearance of the pattern of evidence eschatology? Huh? Song of Moses. Yes. Yes. The Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32. The intervention of God to save his people when they're about to be destroyed. Yeah. All right. Deuteronomy 32, at the end. Oh, by the way, the pertinent verses for DTR2, the pertinent verses for DTR2, the things that made it most significant for him, the reason he included the song in the first place was that it suggests that God wouldn't let an exile that utterly destroyed God's people, that he would save them. Those verses are 26 and 27. Remember that. Why is the Song of Moses, why has it been appended to Deuteronomy? It's because the second historian wanted us to know that we weren't going to be in exile forever. Right? And here we find in this ancient song these words, which DTR2 doubtless took as a predictive prophecy. Now this is something that we see, a pattern that we see again and again in Scripture. Something that isn't technically a prediction comes to be treated as if it was a prediction. All right? In chapter 32, verse 26, it says, this is God speaking, I would have said, I will scatter them afar, I will make the remembrance of them cease from among men, had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should judge amiss, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant, Yahweh has not wrought all this. So DTR2 saw in this God's promise that he would not make the remembrance of them cease from among men, that he would save and restore his people. And so he uses that as a prediction, and he turns it into a prediction in these chapters that we have been reading. Chapter 30 and 31 becomes a prediction that they're going to be brought back from exile, that they're not going to be in exile forever. Okay? This pattern of turning a statement or comment by God into a prediction is very early. You see, it's already here in Deuteronomy. All right.
Can you give us some others?
Oh, when we get into the prophets, we're going to find innumerable examples of what we think as predictions, which weren't predictions at all. We're going to come across them every time we study. All right, now, verse 48, tell me what this is. And Yahweh said to Moses that very day, ascend this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab opposite Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I give to the people of Israel for possession, and die on the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people. Because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not revere me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel. For you shall see the land before you, but you shall not go in there, into the land which I give to the people of Israel. What is that?
That's clear back before they crossed.
Yeah. Well, what would you? How would you describe this paragraph? What is it? An introduction? Huh?
Right.
It's an ending, of course. It's an ending. Well, now where does it come from? It's the end of the story. Moses is told to die.
It's probably
Well, we know that Deuteronomy grew by layers. This is very interesting. Look at Numbers 27, verses 12 to 14. Keep your finger here because we want to compare. Numbers 27. I want you to catch the phrasing, because this phrasing is not Deuteronomic at all, is it? Yahweh said to Moses, do you have it? 27:12? 27:12, Numbers 27:12. Yahweh said to Moses, go up into this mountain of Abarim. Do you see the similarity in the phrasing? And see the land which I have given to the people of Israel. And when you have seen it, you shall be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was gathered, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin during the strife of the congregation to sanctify me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Merabath Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Now, if you look at what we have here, it's a paraphrase of those verses. This phrasing, the mountains of Abarim and so forth, is interesting. We saw the introduction to Deuteronomy is twofold. Let's look at keep your finger in here. Let's look back at the two introductions to Deuteronomy. First, the original introduction in 4:44. Deuteronomy 4:44, the original introduction to the core of the book. And you'll see right away. This is the day which Moses set, this is the law which Moses set before the children of Israel. These are the testimonies, the statutes, and the ordinances which Moses spoke to the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt beyond the Jordan, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, in the land of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, whom Moses and the children of Israel defeated when they came out of Egypt. And they took possession of his land, and the land of Og the king of Bashan, the two kings of the Amorites, who lived to the east beyond the Jordan, from Aurora, which is on the edge of the valley of the Arnon, as far as Mount Sirion, that is Hermon, together with all the Arabah on the eastern slope of Jordan, as far as the Sea of Arabah, under the slopes of Pisgah. Now, unless you are absolutely already asleep, you recognize that there's no similarity in place names and description between this and what we're reading in chapter 32. It's not like the introduction to the body of Deuteronomy at all. Maybe we're just looking at the wrong introduction. Let's look at the one that the Deuteronomic historian gives us in chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness of the Arabah, over against Suph, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hatzeroth, and Dizayah. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. And in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that Yahweh had given him in commandment to them, after he had defeated Sihon the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and in Edrei, beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab. Moses undertook to explain this law, saying, once again, is there similarity or difference between this introduction and the conclusion we're reading in chapter 32? What is it? It's completely different. All right, but we notice it's virtually a paraphrase of Numbers 27. And now let's look at Numbers 33. Verse 44. Well, we'll start in verse 41. Numbers 33. This is, if you've forgotten, Numbers 33 is the 40 stations of the Exodus. Numbers 33 was once a big deal in this class. We studied it and studied it and studied it again, because it was the chapter from which the 7 divisions that P chose came from. It was the chapter where we actually got an idea of how a biblical author worked. He had Numbers 33 before him, and we saw how he developed his 7 divisions of the Exodus from the 40 stations. All right, now verse 41. And they set out from Mount Hor and encamped at Zalmonah. And they set out from Zalmonah and encamped in Punon. And they set out from Punon and encamped in Oboth. And they set out from Oboth and encamped in Yea Abarim. Now the importance there is, there's Yea Abarim, Abarim, right? Ascend to this mountain of the Abarim. Yea just means the ruins, right? We have the Ai that is destroyed by Joshua later, means the ruin. Yea Abarim in the territory of Moab. They set out from Iyim and encamped at Dibon Gad. They set out from Dibon Gad and encamped at Almon Diblathaim. And they set out from Almon Diblathaim and encamped in the mountains of Abarim before Nebo. And they set out from the mountains of Abarim and encamped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, and encamped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth as far as Abel Shittim in the plains of Moab. And so what do I see here? This is the same description that we have in Deuteronomy 32, 48 and following. What am I saying? Where is this conclusion from? It's Numbers. How did a piece of the conclusion of Numbers get here? Well, first of all, it goes without saying that this point was once what? Once upon a time, this point right here was what? The end of what? After we have read Deuteronomy 32, what had we come to? We come to the end of Deuteronomy. Once upon a time, Deuteronomy didn't have chapter 33. This was the end. And where did they get an ending for it? Somebody took an end from the book of Numbers and put it at what was then the end of Deuteronomy. I'm a little disappointed that some of you didn't notice that this was an end. It says clearly, and they all lived happily ever after. Recognize an ending for what it is. But how could it be the end of the book, you say? There's more Deuteronomy. What's the answer? Yes, it was added on. Now, Roy, why didn't the guy who added chapter 33 take out the ending? Verses 32:48 to 32:52. Well, yes, of course. That's the point. The reason that we can see all this editorial process in the Bible, the reason it's so clear, is that nobody did what? Nobody took away. Why? There must have been something operating that in all these different levels of editorial work, nobody took anything away. What can we deduce must have been the reason for this failure to ever touch what was already there, even when it didn't mesh anymore? Huh? Well, there were curses attached. So what does that say? It says they regarded it as what? They regarded it as sacred scripture that couldn't be touched. Right? Yeah. So here we have an ending, and then we have added to it something else. Chapter 33:1. Are you all with me? Does anybody want to ask a question so far? 33:1. Ray, is this clear? Does this make sense? The verses at the end of chapter 32 are a conclusion. They were placed there when chapter 32 was the end of the book. The person who put them there got them from the book of Numbers. Once again, I'm telling you that P has priority. Once again, J, E, D, and P. That's the way it's been for 250 years, according to the standard scholarship. And I'm saying, no, it isn't D and P. Deuteronomy didn't come first and P come after the exile with Ezra. I'm saying that's not what happened. It wasn't J, E, D, and P. This is the standard way of saying it. It was J, E, D, and P. Now what have I told you?
J, E, D.
Now these are supposed to be a succession. And first of all, I'm telling you that's typical of the belief system of evolution. J and E are the succession. What are they? I have to put E on top because it's a spatial relationship. E is the north, and J develops in the south, and then what?
P.
Then P. Am I doing this right? Then, no.
P is in the north, isn't it?
No,
P
P is Hezekiah's reform, right? And after Hezekiah, yeah. Now watch this. D is north, right? But then it follows P in Judah. You got it? So I should have. Are you people following me now? J and E weren't one after another. One represents the development of theology in the northern kingdom and the other in the southern kingdom, from which came the prophetic movement and the D literature. At the same time, Hezekiah's reform brought forward the final form that we have in P, right? And then, after the fall of the northern kingdom, D came south. So, it's more complicated than the evolutionists told us. Alright? Does this make sense to you, Roy? Yes.
Are E and J contemporary?
Yes. That's exactly what the point I'm trying to make. E and J and their development into D and P were contemporary. What does evolution want to do? Yeah, it wants to evolve it. And that's not at all. There is evolution, but not at all the way they described it. All right, Ed? This is an important little chart here. That's why I say that a piece of P's ending could be added on to Deuteronomy because P was already there in the south.
So in this D, you're having sort of collectively the core of D, Deuteronomy
Yeah,
plus D are one.
Yeah, that's right. It gets D, this is D prime over here.
Where was DTR 1 suit?
Well, that would be this down here. Those are commas. D, comma, D1, comma, D2. Okay. You have to be careful with this group. That's right. Remember that there are people, and I'm going to show you another place later, who say that there was no D, E, J, or P. Well, there's tremendous evidence otherwise. Otherwise, we'd have to say that Moses was a person who had a split personality, and there were 4 distinct personalities in him, and he lived for 600 years. That's the other logical way to say it. All right? Now, this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. He said, what is that? Is that an introduction? Yes. Once upon a time. And it's quite an independent introduction, isn't it? That introduction could have been there even before it was added to the book. Right? So, my question, you should be able to anticipate my question. What is this doing here? We've already come to the end of Deuteronomy. What is this doing here?
Moses' memoirs. It's found later than that.
Do you want to try that again? No. What?
Somebody acting as Moses to start.
Well, I noticed that it seems to be a ritual blessing. It comes at the end of the book. It mentions the 12 tribes. Does anybody think of anything that's similar? What?
Testament of Jacob.
The Testament of Jacob, chapter 49. Good, Genesis 49. Let's whip right over there. You can't think of Deuteronomy 33 without thinking of its parallel in Genesis 49. Any more than you could think of the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy 28 without thinking of its parallel chapter in Leviticus. Where are the blessings and curses in P? Leviticus? I'm sure it must have been on a hot summer day when everybody was drowsy that we studied Leviticus 26. All right, now Genesis 49. We got to get some key chapters down and memorize. Genesis 49. And Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall befall you in days to come. Assemble and hear, O sons of Jacob, and hearken to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn." Verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Verse 8, Judah your brothers shall praise you. Verse 13, Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. 14, Issachar is a strong ass. 16, Dan shall judge his people. 19, raiders shall raid Gad. 20, Asher's food shall be rich. 21, Naphtali is a hind let loose. 22, Joseph is a fruitful bough. You get the symbols of the tribes there. And in some of these various sections you have only the incipit. Do you remember that incipit is the word for the first couplet of a poem and the rest of the poem is missing? For instance, Genesis 49 verse 19. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. That's not the whole story. What is it?
Beginning and the end.
No, it's not the beginning and the end. The incipit means what? This is what? That's the beginning of the poem about Gad, but what? The rest of it is missing. How can you tell? Because when I read the prose form of some of these things in Joshua, I discover other things that are called catchwords in the prose, where you can tell this is a word that usually it parallels another word in a poem. And this prose description, if we remove connectors, and, thus, and howevers, and shorten it up, we can turn it into a couplet of poetry, and we discover that we're looking at additional lines of poetry. So I'm telling you that a lot of the prose, we can tell, was originally developed from poetry, and probably from oral tradition, right?
What might the rest of this you tell from what it starts out saying?
Yeah. There's a whole section. There's a whole section of Joshua that describes the inheritance of the tribes. Now, when we get to that section, we'll look back at how individual tribes are treated in Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33 in comparison to the prose description and what we know about the land and the area they occupied and so forth. The inheritance of 12 tribes. It anticipates, and it's Deuteronomy 33 isn't the place to do that. Well, we'll do that when we get to Joshua, what each of the tribes was all about and so forth. The question I have now is, as I read through Deuteronomy 33 and I read through Genesis 49, I notice that structurally they are the same thing. They're the same kind of thing. And it makes me wonder, about these descriptions of the 12 tribes with some blessing or special role ascribed to each tribe, where could such a thing have originated? Well, one answer is maybe these are the very words that Jacob said on the last day of his life, word for word, verbatim, and miraculously, and that's how we'd have to say it, miraculously transmitted to us. Okay? In which case, Jacob really was writing a long predictive prophecy, because of course we notice that Jacob talks about the royal scepter coming to Judah. And that gives you a hint right there. When did the royal scepter come to Judah? With David, yes. We notice that in Genesis 49, Reuben is indeed first. Simeon and Levi are treated together. All right. Judah is the longest, by far the longest tribe, with all the rich blessings of fertility ascribed to Judah. The northern tribes are treated very, very, very briefly, and Ephraim and Manasseh are treated together as Joseph. All right? Yes?
I notice in Genesis, Judah is a lion as well.
Mm-hmm.
In Deuteronomy, Dan is a lion as well. Why
Yeah.
change position?
Yes. Yes. That's the question I'm asking, which is, and I'm arriving at it now, these are the same kinds of thing. First, number one, where could such things have arisen? And number two, which of these poems, or groups of poems, or rounds, series of poems, is earlier? Genesis 49 or Deuteronomy 33? Or don't be thick-headed here and say, oh, Jacob lived before Moses, therefore Genesis 49 is first. If you say that, you're missing the point totally and have to start over from square one. That's not it at all. Let's get the basic question down. Where, under what circumstances, in what environment, or what kind of activity could these poems have arisen?
Some festival.
Some festival. That's always a safe answer. Happens to be a correct one, yes. Now, can we nail down what festival or what are they doing?
Well, I would say one was down with P and one was up with P. And
Yes, that's... You're certainly an insightful man. Genesis 49 is part of the P literature, and it's not surprising that Deuteronomy 33 was part of the D literature. That's how it happened to end up in Deuteronomy.
P wrote this a little.
Here's a man who, though he's tired, isn't missing anything.
P wrote this after P wrote it.
Well, wait a minute now. Back up a minute. When P or D uses something, have I said they wrote it?
No.
No. Mm-mm. No. The point of its imposition into our books is not its point of origin. Remember, the Deuteronomic literature, the final Deuteronomic composition is way down in the exile, sometime after 560, after Jehoiakim gets out of prison. That isn't the time any of this was written. They're making use of earlier stuff. DTR1 uses ancient material in his first description in Genesis 1-4, in Deuteronomy 1-4. DTR2 is using the Song of Moses, which is very ancient, to prove that, see, that's his proof that we're not going to stay in exile. Here's this ancient prediction. Okay, that's his proof text. Okay, so now, getting back, what would have been the circumstances for the creation of these series of poems about the tribes?
Seems that when David became king, it would be his advantage to elevate Judah and take away whatever belongs to David. That's how he would prefer.
Well, one of the things that we have noted is that David was or was not question, respectful of the tribal league and its traditions. Was. Who was the innovator who broke up the old tribal league and broke down its system? Solomon. Yes. It was Solomon who broke up the old tribal league, and he was only able to do that because his father had been reigning for 40 years. And when he was in the middle of his reign, 60, 70 years had passed since the tribal league had actually been running things, and he was the great emperor of the greatest empire of his age, and he was able to break down the old tribal league. And it was too weak by then for the elders to say no. David never could have done that. If David had said, I'm going to break down the tribal league system, what would have happened? Yeah, they'd have thrown him right out and elected another king. Remember how they were still formally electing kings? Even Solomon's son went to Shechem to be elected. Remember that? That's the old tribal league. So yes, the old tribal league system is where the tribes gathered together, right? And there, would it not be appropriate, because we see it in the prose passages like Genesis 24, at the end of the covenant renewal ceremony, the covenant mediator, playing the role of Moses, did what? He blessed the tribes. And that's where these poems originate. Okay? Now, as this was done over and over again for centuries, you can be sure that many such blessings developed. And what I'm asking now is, of Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33, which describes the earlier and which describes the later situation? 33 is considerably earlier. It describes a much earlier political situation, early in the Judges, and Genesis 49 describes virtually the Davidic monarchy. Well, were they still having covenant ceremonies in the Davidic monarchy? Oh, yes. Yes. And what's happening in Genesis 49 is the Davidic monarchy is being seen as the fulfillment of the promise to Jacob. Getting it? Ah, okay. Yes. In fact, we could say that Genesis 49 is the theological underpinnings of David's right, yes, to be the royal one, ruling over all the other tribes.
Right in quotation marks.
Well, no. They said, this is what God said through Jacob. This is what the word of the Lord says. See, it happened. Yeah?
So was Genesis 49 written slightly before David's reign, during his reign, or after his reign?
Oh, I think it was written during his reign, if you mean by written, edited.
And taken to mean the validation of his kingship.
Of his kingship, yes. See, you can't make the liberal mistake that final form equals origin. Right?
So you think Jacob might have really said some of this stuff?
It was a tradition for the patriarch to bless the family. So certainly the narrative portion of Genesis says that at that point, before Jacob died, he blessed his sons. And it's perfectly logical for when they're composing Genesis to put, at that point, one of these blessings on the 12 tribes that they have around by then. Some of this stuff, Ed, in Genesis 49 is very early. Okay. Let's look at Deuteronomy 33, however, and see what sort of a description it provides. First of all, let us notice that the 12 tribe blessings are in the middle of a poem which is broken in half to insert the blessings of the tribes. The poem begins in 33:2, Yahweh came from Sinai, and continues down through verse 5, then continues in verse 26, and 27, 28, and 29. Okay? It's the Divine Warrior poem. It's one of the many Divine Warrior poems. Yahweh's a man of war, it says in Genesis 15. The Divine Warrior is marching through the south. We saw this in Habakkuk 3. We looked at it in a number of the Psalms. We saw it here. We've actually already read and studied this, but we're going to look at it again. I'm sure you remember that. Let's see here. Here it says, Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. Yea, he loved his people. All those consecrated to him were in his hand. So they followed in thy steps, receiving direction from thee. When Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Does the author here indicate that he is Moses, or that he's looking back upon the time of Moses? Yes. When Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Notice that the law is the possession of the assembly. The assembly, the congregation. What's the word? I think you'll find it. Kahal. Kahale. What does that tell you? The setting of this poem is what? The people are what? They're gathered together. Yeah. Thus, yeah. This word is sometimes translated congregation, which of course the word congregation doesn't mean, we take it as a formal term for the group in church, but it literally means what? Those who have gathered, congregated, right? All right. And the law, listen, writing was very early in Moses' time. The old Sinaitic texts show us that they did have writing, but it was right at the dawn of writing in Moses' time. But there's one thing even the earliest and oldest sources agree on about Moses. Not that he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, but what? It says it over and over again in so many different places. The tradition is unanimous about this, that Moses wrote something. What did he write? He wrote laws. Yes. Moses is remembered as the father of Yahwism who wrote laws. And those laws were the center or core of what became Yahwism. When Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Thus, notice, thus, via Moses giving the law, Yahweh became king in Yeshurun. We already saw from the Song of Moses last week that Yeshurun is just a denominative form of the adjective yashar, to be upright, righteous, upright, ramrod, straight. And Yeshurun is the upright one. That's the noun form of that. Thus Yahweh became king of the upright, we could say. Here it is. When the heads of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. So it's very clear. What is the context or setting of this? The heads of the peoples are gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. Now when did that happen? Yeah, the covenant ceremony. And how often was that? Every 7 years. Where? At Shechem originally. We went through the strange history of Shechem, and then it was moved where? No, long before Jerusalem. Where? Where next?
Bethel.
No, too soon. Shiloh. See, when you make the skip to Bethel, you've made the triumph of the Aaronites. Remember? At Shechem, we're talking about Mushites. At Shiloh, we're talking about Mushites. By the time we get to Bethel and Jerusalem, who's won? The Aaronites. This is a complicated story. You know, it would be nice if Moses had just sat down and written the first 5 books of the Bible. That would have been easier, right?
He couldn't have been dead.
Well, that's okay, but it would have been easier. All right, so we're talking about a covenant ceremony. Verse 26. There is none like El, O Yeshua. May I remind you that much more in the north than in the south, they continue to equate Yahweh with El, the old patriarchal God. Right?
Of course, this is all obliterated in King James Version. You can't see that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. You can't see that in the King James. There is none like El, O Yeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, and in his majesty through the skies. The eternal El is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. And he thrust out the enemy before you and said, destroy. So Israel dwelt in safety, the fountain of Jacob alone, in a land of grain and wine. Yea, his heavens dropped down dew. Happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you? A people saved by Yahweh, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph. Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you shall tread upon their necks. Do you have the translation high places? Yeah. You look at these ancient seals. The triumphant warrior did what? He held up his spear and he put his foot where? On the person's head or neck, which happens to be their high places if you want to be technical, when they're standing up. Okay. Yeah. All right. So, in this context now, we have the actual statements. The incipit for Reuben. Let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few. What does that tell you? By this time, what is the case? So what's happened? Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh settled in Transjordan. Reuben in the south near Moab and Ammon. And what has happened here? How has Reuben fared? Reuben's at the point of disappearing as a family that can be recognized. Let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few. What does that tell you? His men are few. This is a prayer that Reuben will survive as a tribe. And of course, this Reuben, Gad, half the tribe of Manasseh, what happens? It isn't very long before we read in Joshua Judges what? No. It's just Gilead, it's just Transjordan. All right. Has Judah risen to prominence yet, Pete?
I think so.
Well, the whole of Judah is verse 7. No. And this he said of Judah, hear, O Yahweh, the voice of Judah, and bring him in to his people. With thy hands contend for him, and be a help against his adversaries. I gather, how's it going for Judah? What are they trying to do? Have they possessed their land yet? No. They're trying to possess their land, and how are they doing? Yeah. This is not the Judah of Genesis 49, which is the greatest of the tribes and has subsumed Simeon, and the monarchy has come from Judah and all the fertility of the land, and Judah is a great kingdom by Genesis 49. Here it's what? It's a group of people struggling valiantly to take possession of their inheritance, and by no means clear that they're going to win, is it? All right. And of Levi he said, give to Levi thy Thummim and thy Urim to the godly one, whom thou didst test at Massa, with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah, who said of his father and mother, I regard them not. He disowned his brothers and ignored his children, for they observed thy word and kept thy covenant. What is this about? Well, we remember something vaguely about Massa and Meribah, don't we? Has anybody got any thoughts? Well, of course, if we're talking about the Levitical priesthood, in our minds, see, we already read P. P won in the long run. We've got to remember that. We've been indoctrinated by P. Long before we got to D, we read a lot of P. So that when we think of the priesthood of Levi, we think of what? Aaron. Right? Automatically. What family was the Levitical priest? What are you going to say? Family of Aaron, of course. That's because the Aaronites won. Now let's go back to Exodus 17. See if we can unravel Massa and Meribah. Because here, I want to say here, listen carefully. Now you all know how I admire P. I've often said he was in many ways the most important biblical writer. He set the whole law and gave it the form it now stands. Without P we couldn't have had a Bible. He was the beginner of canonization, and on and on. You all know how I admire P. The reform of Hezekiah never would have happened. He furthered monotheism and on and so on. But right here P is being tricky. Okay? It reads in Exodus 17 thus: all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of Yahweh, and encamped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Now this is one of P's 7 stages of the Exodus. Alright? They're not at Sinai yet. Is everybody clear on that? They're not at Sinai yet, because they're going to move on from there to Sinai. How do I know that? Because I read in Exodus 19, verse 1, take a look. I read the 7th of P's 12 stations of the Exodus. On the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone forth out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai, and when they set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, they encamped in the wilderness, and there Israel encamped before the mountain. Okay? So you're all clear that in Exodus 17, when Israel gets to Rephidim, they're not at Sinai yet. This is only the 6th of the 12 stages. We don't get to 7 till we get to Exodus 19, which goes all the way to Numbers 10:10. Now, reading Exodus 17. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of Yahweh, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people found fault with Moses, who's the center of the story, and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you find fault with me? Why do you put Yahweh to the proof? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" So Moses cried to Yahweh. It is Moses, not what? What?
Not Aaron.
Well, it wouldn't have said Aaron. It would have said what? Moses and Aaron, right? This is a story about Moses. So Moses cried to Yahweh, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And Yahweh said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the rod with which you struck the Nile, and go." Verse 6. Everybody look. "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, that the people may drink." Everybody should say, "Wait a minute. What? What? Wait a minute. What's going on here?" This is what? Despite P's editorial headings, what is this? Yes, because where is this? As the story says, where is this? This is at Horeb, which, as you already know, is E's name for the sacred mountain. Who's writing here? Who's writing here? We know that the earliest stories in narrative form from the north are E. Now, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massa, which is proof, and Meribah, that is contention, because of the fault finding of the children of Israel, and because they put Yahweh to the proof by saying, "Is Yahweh among us or not?" Now, this is not the end of the story. P has broken up the story. At this point, what do we have? We have water coming out of a rock where? At Horeb, at the sacred mountain. Now, what follows after this is insertion from other sources. The next...
Is that Sinai?
Yes. But Sinai is the name that is used for it generally where? The mountain of Sinai is a designation that we see in P. Horeb is a designation that we see from the north in E and D. All right? E's narrative picks up several chapters later. All sorts of other stuff is inserted, and the rest of the story isn't for several chapters. Okay? The story picks up again when Moses finds the golden calf. Exodus 32.
So they really are at Sinai.
Yeah. Look at verse 25. When Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to their shame among their enemies. Remember that E is Mushite in stance, right? E is Mushite in stance. Remember that. It downplays Aaron.
Why
But-
did they make it naked rather than broken loose?
What?
King James Version says that Moses saw the people were naked.
That's an interpretation, yeah. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on Yahweh's side? Come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him, and he said to them, Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, put every man his sword on his side, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his bosom companion, and every man his fellow. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000. And Moses said, Today you have ordained yourself for the service of Yahweh, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, that he may bestow a blessing upon you this day. Now, in E, these are all one story. There's Moses and the Levites against Aaron and the people. That's the story as E told it. Now you can't get that out of it now because P has broken it all up. And I have to say that P was being a little tricky after all. Who is P? He is par excellence an Aaronite. Yes. That's right. Covenant law comes through Aaron. Now,
How can you really tell that this in chapter 32:25 goes with that?
well, because when you separate out P, J, and E, you get J and E, two running stories of narrative. How they left Egypt, how they came to Sinai, how they moved on into the wilderness. It's very simple to do. And these are the E stories all in order. And one of the things that you notice is the Lord God. One of the things, it's very dramatic. You see the Lord God over and over again. Why is that of significance? Because you kept getting this El and Elohim in the story. It's the mark of E. And he's quite consistent with it. Now, the story as we have reconstructed it is the story that's found here in Deuteronomy 33. Look, verse 8. Let's read it again, and I'm sure you'll see something different in it this time. And of Levi he said, who's Levi? The tribe of whom? Levi is the tribe of whom? Of Moses. Are you missing it? The whole point of this exercise for the last 10 minutes has been to show you that in the Northern Kingdom's literature, in E and D, Levi is the tribe of Moses. It's Moses and Levi against Aaron and Israel. It's Moses and Levi against Aaron, the leader of this rebelling congregation, and that rebelling congregation. Aaron and the people as a whole are the bad guys. Moses and the Levites are the good guys. As E tells the story, Moses strikes the rock and gives them water, goes up to receive the law. They rebel against God and Moses by what? Making the calf, except for the Levites, who are waiting for Moses to come back. Moses comes back, he finds the calf, he grinds it up and throws it into the water. What water? The water coming from the rock. It's all one story. Now, that's how we have it here in D. And of Levi he said, Give to Levi thy Thummim, and thy Urim to thy godly one, whom thou didst test at Massah, with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah, who said of his father and mother, I regard them not. He disowned his brothers and ignored his children.
That's talking about when they were killing their...
That's right. That's the passage we just read.
So it was very tactful in this.
Yeah. Okay, did you see the passage we just read in Exodus 32? That's what it's referring
It was
to.
the point that they were at Rephidim and there was no water, so they really didn't stay at Rephidim.
No, wait, whoa. Don't confuse the issue by bringing in P's editorial headings. They don't agree with the story as E told it at all. They aren't at Rephidim in E's story. Where are they? They're at Horeb, the mountain of God. Yes, verse 29. Today you have ordained yourselves for the service of Yahweh, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, that he may bestow a blessing upon you this day. Slay your companion, your bosom friend, who said of his father and mother, I regard them not. He disowned his brothers and ignored his children. For they observed thy word and kept thy covenant. And of course the covenant was broken by everybody else, by the calf.
So they knew who to kill by who they saw worse.
That's right. They shall teach Jacob thy ordinances and Israel thy law. And they shall put incense before thee and whole burnt offering upon thy altar. The remarkable thing about this is all about Moses and the Levites. As separate from the Aaronites. I have to presume, Roy, that when this was written at a covenant renewal ceremony in the northern kingdom, the priests who were officiating were what? Were Moshite priests. Bless, O Yahweh, his substance, and accept the work of his hands. Crush the loins of his adversaries and those who hate him, that they rise not again. This is why Psalm 90 is ascribed to Moses.
So how come they don't mention Simeon here?
That's a very, very, very good question. What do you suppose has happened to Simeon by this time?
Disappeared?
Yes, exactly. He has disappeared. Psalm 90. What do you see in the traditional superscription of the psalm? The prayer of Moses, the man of God.
Yeah.
You all see that?
That's actually the Hebrew, not just the translation.
Oh no, all these headings are Hebrew headings. This is the traditional heading for Psalm 90. I wonder why. Because Psalm 90 is about God's eternal nature as opposed to man's fleeting nature, and it ends with a famous prayer. Psalm 90, look at the end of it. Verse 13. Return, O Yahweh, how long? Have pity on thy servants. Satisfy us in the morning with thy steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad as many days as thou hast afflicted us, and as many years as we have seen evil. Let thy work be manifest to thy servants, and thy glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish thou the work of our hands upon us. Yea, the work of our hands, establish thou it. It's one of the most famous passages in the Bible. The idea being that everything that man does is transitory. That it can only be established if what? It's established by God, whose work is eternal. Those lines at the end of verse 17, what does it say here? Deuteronomy 32:11. Bless, O Yahweh, his substance, and accept the work of his hands. Crush the loins of his adversaries and of those that hate him, that they rise not again. That verse in Deuteronomy 33 and its similarity to the end of Psalm 90 is what caused Psalm 90 to be ascribed to Moses. And of course, the people who ascribed Psalm 90 to Moses knew then that this section about Levi was about what? Moses. Let's see now. Psalm 90. Okay. All right, now. Yes? No. Everybody still with me? Has anybody fallen off the theology train yet? Why didn't all God's people just get together and agree with each other in Bible times? I thought they were all one people in Bible times, and we just have these arguments today.
You have a brother or sister? Agree with them all?
Yeah, one big happy family. This was a big happy family. Now then, of Benjamin he said, the beloved of Yahweh, he dwells in safety by him. He encompasses him all day long and makes his dwelling between his shoulders. Looks like Benjamin was doing okay. Of Joseph he said, blessed by Yahweh be his land, with the choicest gifts of heaven above, and of the deep that couches beneath, with the choicest fruits of the sun, and the rich yield of the months, with the finest produce of the ancient mountains, and the abundance of the everlasting hills, with the best gifts of the earth in its fullness, and the favor of him that dwelt in the bush. Let these come on the head of Joseph, and upon the crown of the head of him that is prince among his brothers. What's the leading tribe when this is written? Joseph. His firstling bull has majesty, and his horns are the horns of a wild ox. With them he shall push the peoples, all of them, to the ends of the earth. Such are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and such are the thousands of Manasseh.
10,000 going in. Sort of like clans or something in this, where it says here, or did it mean thousands at this time?
Oh yeah, clans. I'm sure that this is, thousands is an interpretation of the word later. It's our interpretation of the word later, after the fact.
So if you go to our map, Book of Israel, and for the time period of this.
Yes. Yes, that's the point. When you read, when we take up Aharoni's land of the Bible, when we start reading Joshua, we're going to see that the demarcation of the tribes, but this is early in the Judges period, right? When Ephraim and Manasseh are the leading tribes, and they have conquered the Central Highlands first, and before the other tribes are successful, while the Transjordanian tribes are disappearing, this is clearly much earlier than Genesis 49. Okay.
The date?
Huh?
The date?
Well, of course, this is before they were writing history as such, right? By the time we get down to the monarchy of the kings, in the 7th year of King Uzziah, such and such a thing happened. But in the Judges, do we hear any of that? We don't even know the approximate reigns of the Judges or how they related to each other. We don't know whether they're consecutive or concurrent, some are consecutive and some concurrent, and so forth. Yeah.
I can understand the precious fruits brought forth from the sun. I think that one of the precious things brought forth from the moon.
Where do you see that? Oh, the months. Uriach, the word for moon and months is the same word. And the rich yield of the months. Oh, if you want to say moon, of course month and moon are the same word. You understand that in English. Month, the word month is just moon. It's a line in parallelism, so you could translate it moon just fine. Choicest fruits of the sun and the rich yield of the moon. The sun and moon rule the heavens and give the produce on the earth.
That's why I was saying I could see that from the sun, but I didn't get it from the moon.
That's because you live in the 20th century. You don't believe that moonlight causes things to grow, but that's only because you live in the 20th century.
Oh, no, but in Central America, they go by the moon all the time.
No, but not...
Thankfully, the
Not just, that's right.
Just through to the bay and the, is that what
I
it's?
don't know.
No.
Yes, they do. You go have to go to them down there.
Well, they may, because of the point that I'm making to Pete. In the ancient world, they believed that the moon brought fertility just as much as the sun, and that moonlight caused things to grow just like sunlight. We don't think of rushing our plants out and make sure that they're in the window so they can get a real good moonlight, so they can get a lot of growing in. But in ancient times, that's exactly what folks thought. Okay, interesting. We really are far away from them in some ways, aren't we? Well, they are far away from us. And of Zebulun he said, Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call peoples to their mountain. There they offer right sacrifices. Apparently, they have a mountain in Zebulun and Issachar that's a sacred mountain. Well, the most likely candidate is Mount Tabor, that big round mountain at the east end of the Jezreel Valley, that we also assume is the Mount of Transfiguration, because it's by far the most likely place for the Transfiguration to have occurred. So we go to that mountain today and we see the Chapel of the Transfiguration at the top, and nobody says this is Issachar and Zebulun's sacred mountain. But they could. For they suck the affluence of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand. That's of course because they were fishermen along the Sea of Galilee. And of Gad he said, now this is the Transjordanian tribe that survived, Blessed be he who enlarges Gad. Reuben's disappearing, but Gad is enlarging. Gad couches like a lion. He tears the arm and the crown of the head. He chose the best of the land for himself, and there a commander's portion was reserved. And he came to the heads of the people. With Israel he executed the commands and just decrees of Yahweh. Dan has already moved from its coastal location, where it could not overcome the Philistines, to the north, to the city of Dan here. Of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's whelp that leaps forth from Bashan. So Dan is already in the north. You know the story of the Danites moving and they stole Micah's idol, and oh, we're going to have so much fun when we get to Judges. Right. Of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full of the blessing of Yahweh, possess the lake in the south. The lake of Galilee and the land south of it. Alright. Of Asher he said, Blessed above sons be Asher, let him be the favorite of his brothers, and let him dip his foot in oil. Your bars shall be iron and bronze, and as your days, so shall your strength be.
What kind of oil is that, olive oil or?
Yes, olive oil, yeah. Alright. Iron and bronze. It's the Iron Age. Alright. And then the rest of the Divine Warrior hymn. So there's a lot of stuff in Deuteronomy 33. And we're coming back here. As soon as we get to Joshua, we're coming back to Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33. What?
Somehow I thought so.
Yeah, well, when we do come back, I would like several people here to remember that it's Deuteronomy 33 that's parallel to Genesis 49. Somebody will be able to say Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 by then, too. All right.
I volunteer to remember that.
You volunteer to remember that? Okay. That's very good of you. Well, I'll just remember over that general direction. I'll think it was Sherry or Ray or somebody over there. All right. Now, Now we've got another ending. And we noticed that this ending was an ending that looked suspiciously like King Josiah's ending. So this looks like DTR 1 writing when he put Deuteronomy 1 to 4 in front of the core of the book. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, which sounds more like the wording at the introduction. And Yahweh showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. And Yahweh said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. Now this is a longer description than what we had in the few verses from Numbers. So Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Yahweh, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows the place of his burial to this day.
Who buried him? He. Who's he?
Yahweh, that's the antecedent of the he.
All right.
The this day, of course, is the day of DTR 1, who's writing in the time of Josiah. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended.
I was reading that and my kid said, well, why did he die then?
Oh, yeah, why did he die? What's DTR 1's purpose here? What is he saying? Why did he die?
But God wanted him to die.
That's the answer, yes. Why?
Yeah, but my kid said God killed him. Why did God kill him?
God kept him alive for that long.
Yes, he was 3 generations old. Okay, so yes, because, yeah, that's right, your son is not treating God as passive here, but active. God killed him then, why? Because he kept him alive long enough to get Israel to the border, but Moses wasn't to go in, right? It's a theological reason. Moses did wrong, and Moses wasn't allowed to go in. What was the story now on Moses in Deuteronomy? We read what the story was on Moses in Numbers. What was it on Deuteronomy? Is it Moses' own sin in Deuteronomy that keeps him out of Canaan? Remember, yeah, that's right. This is the pro-Moses section. Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 23. Yes.
Before you go on, since she brought up this other subject here, very often it is we refer to going on to heaven as going to the promised land, etc. And when we consider our eternal salvation, we consider it in light of the general trend of our life as opposed to the occasional deed or misdeed.
Mm-hmm.
It hardly seems fair that Moses didn't get to go to the promised land before he passed on.
Well, it wasn't fair because he was the sin bearer. That's how come they got to go on. Because if he'd gone on, what? They wouldn't have gone on. That's the Deuteronomist point.
Okay.
Verse 23, and I besought Yahweh at that time, saying, O Lord God, thou hast, that's Yahweh Elohim, thou hast only begun to show thy servant thy greatness and thy mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as thine? Let me go over, I pray, and see the good land beyond the Jordan, and the goodly hill country, and the Lebanon. And Yahweh was angry with me on your account, and he would not hearken to me. And Yahweh said to me, let it suffice you. speak to me no more of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah, lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and behold it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan, but to charge Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he shall go over at the head of this people, and he shall put them in possession of the land which you shall see.
He did make it the transfiguration.
Huh?
He did make it.
It made it across to the transfiguration, yes.
I was just going to ask that in connection with it. Is there any evidence that Moses was taken to heaven until the transfiguration? The Israelites have any concept?
Yes. Where does it come up?
Jude.
So that's it.
It comes up in Jude?
Where he was, till this day.
It comes up in Jude? Well, let's read what it says in Jude so that we can find out about that. Jude, of course, is after Christ's time, but I think Jude makes some reference, doesn't he? This will be fun, Dawn. This bears on the question that's still on the table about canonization. Yes. Verse 8. Yet in like manner, these men in their dreamings defile the flesh, reject authority, and revile the holy ones. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, disputed about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a reviling judgment upon him, but he said, "The Lord rebukes you." But these men revile whatever they do not understand, and so forth. This is an allusion to a passage in the work entitled The Assumption of Moses. In the intertestamental work, The Assumption of Moses. In the Apocrypha, if you read The Assumption of Moses, it's about how Moses was assumed into heaven, and it tells this whole story of Michael the archangel fighting with the devil over the body of Moses. Jude is quoting that story. Yes, so that's the 3rd or 2nd century BC. And then, of course, we have the famous statement in Romans. This is really just to see if I know anything about the New Testament. I understand the point of your question. Now, I don't know where in Romans 3 it says this, but it says, death reigned from Adam to Moses. We'll study the New Testament soon. And then do you have a concordance there? Do you remember the passage that I'm referring to? Yes, okay. It's Romans 5. It's not even very far from where I thought it was. It's Romans 5 and verse 14. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who was the type of the one who was to come. He's talking about resurrection there, that everybody who died stayed dead. He's not talking about Enoch. He's talking about death. It doesn't apply to Enoch. He's not forgetting Enoch. It just doesn't apply. Everybody who died stayed dead from Adam to Moses. Paul, as a rabbi, knows the tradition that Moses was resurrected. But that's an intertestamental tradition. If you had asked the Deuteronomist, say, did you know that Moses was resurrected? He would have said, what?
You don't think that's an inference when he says we don't know where he is to this day?
No, but I'll tell you this. That was the proof text that was used in the Assumption of Moses. All right. That's right.
So we don't take quotes of the Apocrypha from the canon books as being evidence of inspiration.
Oh, the question now is, what is Jude, and for that matter James, doing quoting the assumption of Moses if we don't have the assumption of Moses in our canon? Of course, there is that other problem in Jude too.
About Enoch?
Yes, about Enoch. That's something of a problem there. Where does he mention Enoch? Oh yes, it was of these also that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with his holy myriads to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness which they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. End of quote. What's he quoting from? He's quoting from a book called the Book of Enoch.
And that's not even in the Apocrypha. It's not like in Catholic Bible.
Well, I don't know. The Catholic Bibles, what's in the Catholic Bibles is purely an accident of what people knew in the Middle Ages, so that doesn't have any bearing on it. The point is that it's part of the intertestamental Jewish literature that we have not included in the canon. This is a direct quote, a rather extensive direct quote, from the Book of Enoch. And there's other intertestamental literature that gets quoted at length, and indeed there are whole concepts that don't make any sense in the New Testament unless you know the intertestamental literature.
James White and Ellen White, who were there relating to these spiritual
Well, yes, see,
quotes out of the Apocrypha.
there's the thing. Mrs. White's early visions were all annotated. They went through and they inserted the scriptural text that she was referring to in these passages in early writings. And the scriptural annotations have been removed from early writings as is now printed. And that's a shame. Why? Because several of the references were to what? Oh yes, to a lot of those things. This description of Enoch, you know the description of Enoch? With all the that's right out of the Book of Enoch. Yes. You find that humorous?
Yeah, I do.
Well-
I find it humorous because it's the traditional Adventist spirit
All right,
and Catholic.
It doesn't do much for it doesn't do much, that's right, for fundamentalism. That's true. You see, the story is, and I know this story very well. James Stuart, the King of Scotland, was allowed to become the King of England if he would practice the Catholic faith only in private. His mother, you remember, Mary Queen of Scots? Yes. And the deal was that they could have a Catholic king on the throne of England as long as publicly he supported the Church of England, practiced his Catholic faith only in privacy, withdrew the acts of intolerance against the Protestants, and he made a deal that the acts of intolerance that had been passed previously by the Protestants against the Catholics had to be withdrawn, and that everybody could have roughly what we would call religious freedom. Well, then the question was, what about the English Bible? The Catholic Church was busy translating the Bible into English at Reims, right across the canal there. And remember, his mother had also been Queen of France. And there was a deal made with the great Church of England universities that they could meet and translate the Bible in English based on Wycliffe's version and have a Protestant, that is to say, a Church of England, which is just Anglo-Catholicism, Bible, that James would then promulgate as the official Bible of the country, which thereby cut off the Reims Douay version from being our English Bible. We almost ended up with a Catholic version of the Bible. But there was also another deal cut. The apocryphal books would not be slid into various places where they were alleged to be, like Esdras and so forth, wouldn't be mixed in the way they were in the Catholic canon. Rather what? They would be grouped together as the Deuterocanon and separated out from the canon of the Protestant churches and lumped together in a separate section between the Old and New Testaments. Okay? And that continued to be the way that King James Bibles were printed. So that when Ellen White grew up, the Bible was the Old Testament, the New Testament, and of course, the Apocrypha that were in between. So that when Ellen White is seeing all these things in vision and annotating them to the Apocrypha, why is that? That was in her Bible. And the Protestant churches generally, by the 19th century, weren't making a very great distinction between the Old Testament and the Apocrypha. And so, yes, many, many passages in early writings make no sense unless you've read the Apocrypha and read the descriptions there, and you see that, oh, this is a takeoff of one of those descriptions. Brings us to the question of the canon, huh? And of course, we've said over and over again that the evidence is that inspiration works this way. God works on what you know, right, where you're at, and so forth. So why did the church, or why did the White Estate then remove the annotations that James White published the visions with? Well, it's because of the obvious questions that would come up of what are all these things from the Apocrypha doing in these visions? Now, on the matter of what?
And God forbid that we should know those things.
That's, yes. It's the most dangerous thing you can do is to hide something. Why? People will find this out. And as soon as you've hidden it, what? They're going to say, yeah, that's right. Destroys your position. She must not have been inspired. She got this all out of her Bible, including the Apocrypha. She didn't even know it wasn't inspired, and so forth. And then you got all these fundamentalist presuppositions, and you're in a big mess. All right, now, let's read this last paragraph, then we make some comments about the law. The people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. When the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. So the people of Israel obeyed him, and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. None like him, for all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great and terrible deeds which Moses wrought in the sight of all Israel. And that is what? Yeah. That is really the end. Yeah. And of course, we say this is DTR 1. We have Josiah being compared to this as the king like Moses. Now, how did it happen? Well, it happened this way. The patriarchs worshipped their family god, whose name was what? El, whom they identified with the head of the Canaanite pantheon. The patriarchs, however, made a distinction between their family god and the Canaanite religion in that what? The patriarchs, from all that we can glean about them, were monotheists. That is to say, that they identified their God as the high God of the pantheon, but they said what? He was the only God. And so they had an exclusive family covenantal relationship with the God of the fathers. And it was consistently the God of my father, the God of my father, the God of my... El is my kinsman, is the name that Isaac gave to the family god. El is my kinsman, because he was a family god and thereby a family member once they entered into covenant. Now this family god then continued to be worshipped as a sole god, and again we have in the patriarchal stories that the patriarchs commanded their families to what? Get rid of all the other gods because they wanted to maintain this family tradition of monotheism, the worship of only one God. In that way, their religion was distinct from the Canaanite religion in general. They went down into Egypt with this tradition of the family God. Moses goes out into the desert and there becomes acquainted with the ancient desert storm god Yahweh. The ancient desert god Yahweh, with his austere religion, was also a sole god for the Kenite tribes. Now, Moses comes back to Egypt and says, Yahweh has met me in the wilderness and sent me back. The Israelites in Egypt ask very naturally, well, now, who is this Yahweh? And Moses equates this Yahweh, the ancient desert god, with the God of the fathers. Right? He says this is the same God. Okay. And takes Israel into the desert where they become monotheists. Moses writes for them laws. Okay? And the traditional oral stories begin about the fathers, the patriarchs. And the stories begin about the Exodus. And they're passed down through the period of the judges in largely oral form. Israel's ballad singers tell us the story of the Exodus and the entry into Canaan. And these different stories grow up into collections of stories that center around the sacred sites, the temples. And gradually, by the 11th century, when writing becomes writing becomes possible because they have developed an alphabet. They've actually moved away from hieroglyphic types of symbols to actual letters. As the stories begin to be written down, and local traditions develop, and we develop a series of stories around various sanctuaries: Shechem, Shiloh, Bethel, Beersheba. There we go. The law that Ezra is promulgating is the whole deal now. Ezra promulgates Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as a unit. And he calls it the law of Moses. Okay? Together with the books that he has in his possession developed around that law. Joshua to Kings. And there's the beginning of canonization. That's how it happened. The exile caused the linking of D to P. And when D and P were gathered into one, we had a what? We had a canon. Now we have the Bible. Now it's going to grow, but what? You have the core of the Bible. Right? Now, of course, some time had to pass before D and P could be seen as so similar, so much about the same thing that they're a unit, right? Because as we've seen, Deuteronomy and Leviticus are not the same in many ways. And their differences would cause scribal activity and theological discussion for centuries. But Ezra has the primary section of the canon. Ezra has Genesis to Kings as a unit. Now the prophetic material is being gathered, and this was seen by people as a secondary kind of inspired material. Things prophets said. Not things given to Moses, but what? Given to other people after Moses. And so collections were made of prophets. And really, after the time of Ezra, the prophetic canon was virtually complete. We have the great canon of major prophetic material and small prophetic material put together, and it becomes the law and the prophets. All Jews agree, because remember, the religion we have after the exile isn't Yahwism. What is it? It's Judaism. All Jews agreed on the law and the prophets. Okay? The Samaritans were dubious about the prophets because it centered so much on Jerusalem. But the law and the prophets, all Jews agreed on. The argument came where? There were lots of other writings that had claim to fame, that claimed to be the writings of some important or inspired person. Some of the writings, it was hard to figure out whether they were inspired or not, like Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes seems to say such outrageous things. The Proverbs seem rather secular. Esther is rather secular. Was Daniel really written in Babylon? Or was it a product of the Maccabean Wars? And so forth. You get it? This third section was the disputed section. And this section was still open in Jesus' day. Some people said the law and the prophets and the writings. The law and the prophets were until John, Jesus said. Because Jesus only discussed the law and the prophets. That is, those parts of the collection that what? That everybody agreed on. And Jesus even quoted Daniel, but there wasn't much disagreement among Jews that Daniel was an inspired work of a prophet named Daniel who lived in Babylon. There was a little nervousness around the edges in the learned circles, but in popular belief, most people didn't even question the book of Daniel, so he could quote Daniel. And occasionally he could quote other writings like a proverb or something, but in general Jesus did not quote from these other writings, I think for a very obvious reason. What was it? If you get into quoting or trying to prove or illustrate from one of these disputed books, what are you going to do? Yeah, your point is going to be lost in the argument over the validity of that book. Right? So, we have then in the New Testament a reflection of the fact that the third section of our canon was not closed. It was still an issue, and different people had different lists. By Jesus' day, there was the law and the prophets and that other stuff. Right? Now it will be very interesting to us to ask why, if the book of Daniel was from Daniel the prophet in the 6th century living in Babylon, did he not pass Ezra's muster a century and a half later? Why didn't he get into the canon of the law and the prophets? That'll be interesting to find out, right? And we'll have to discuss that as soon as we get to Daniel. But what I've said so far is I've described how the law and the prophets became canonical. Right? Nobody questioned the material that grew up in the prophetic school of Isaiah. Nobody was arguing about the prophetic material that the prophetic school of Jeremiah produced, or Micah, so forth. There was very little question about any of the minor prophets, even Jonah, that Jews regarded largely as a parable, not a historical event, was still, in their minds, a legitimate inspired writing about a legitimate prophet, and there was no question that it should be in the canon. The argument was every book that's found in the prophetic canon is already by the 5th century accepted as the work of a true prophetic movement. It's the stuff in the writings that was disputed. Okay? So the law of the prophets, well, who determined the writings then? Why don't we have Enoch? Why don't we have Assumption of Moses? Why don't we have First Maccabees and so forth? Well, that was determined in the 1st century AD. So we should hold that question until what? Till we get over to the New Testament, right? Okay. All right, so now we have, and of course, the law, right? The law. Well, it's the basis of ethics, right? In the Western world. It's the basis of Western civilization. It's an interesting story of how this came to be the law of Moses. All right, any question or comment? Well, how many hours have we been at this? What are we up to, about 30 tapes? 170 or 180 hours of lecture? Well, we've at least scratched the surface of the... All right.
See, John, God knew you had to have something to do with it. He would have made it simple, then what would have you done?
That's right. Now, okay, so we're going to go on to the theology of the historical books next week. A whole new section. We can invite new people to come if we want to.